Hello. Hi, good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Monica Borland. I'm the CEO of Mother Jones. And thank you. Normally at an event like this, we would be asking you to put your phones on mute, but, for God's sakes, keep the notifications on just in case, the president, I don't even want to joke about it. Which is not what we're going to talk about tonight, but then again, it sort of is what we're going to talk about because what we're really looking at is how we got here. And how we got here, as you know, if you cast your mind back to November 8th of 2016, I know it's hard, Donald J. Trump won the election that night by 70,000 votes in 3 states. Those states were Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. And when you look at Wisconsin was one of the states that had passed a lot of voter suppression laws in the years prior to that election. And as a result of those voter suppression laws, about 45,000 people were not able to cast a ballot. These laws, as you know, affect primarily the young, the poor, communities of color. So 45,000 people who are not able to cast a ballot, that's a conservative estimate. By how many votes was that election decided in Wisconsin? 23,000. So that really illustrates for you what the stakes are when it comes to voting rights. And we know this story, we know what happened in Wisconsin in part because Ari Berman, who will be on the stage tonight, went to Wisconsin and dug into how that came to pass. And he was able to do that. This is my one plug for tonight. He was able to do that because Mother Jones is a reader-supported news organization where our investigative reporting is made possible by the people who care about this kind of work, by all of you. That's why we can do stories that go against the grain, go against the conventional wisdom, take a lot of time and fact-checking to execute. And so thank you very much for that. Speaking of thanks, I have some thank yous and some super quick announcements to make. First of all, we're recording tonight's event for the Mother Jones podcast, which you can find later on wherever you get your podcasts. If you prefer to watch this show again because it's going to be just that great, or if you want to send it to your mother or your brother-in-law, you can find it later this month on Free Speech TV. If you'd like your mother or your brother-in-law to be watching right now, you can tell them to go to the Mother Jones Facebook page where we are streaming live. And if you'd like to share and get all your social media friends to be watching this, please feel free to do that. Feel free to tweet about what's happening tonight. And if you feel so inclined, use the hashtag #ProtectingOurVote. That's right up there. And finally, I want to give a big thank you to the sponsors who made this conversation possible. I want to thank the Razor I want to thank People for the American Way and Ben & Jerry's. And since Ben & Jerry's product pretty much speaks for itself and will speak for itself quite loudly after the show when you get to sample some of it, they have yielded their time to Judith Brown Dianis from the Advancement Project, which is an amazing racial justice organization, and she'll come up here for a second and tell you all about their work. Judith.
Good evening. I want to thank you for having us here to Mother Jones. My name is Judith Brown Dianis. I'm Executive Director of the National Office of Advancement Project. Really excited about the conversation tonight. I've known Ari for a very long time. He has written extensively about the work that we do at Advancement Project, but also just about important voter suppression issues and really has brought a light to it. But also the best Attorney General that a country could ever have, Eric Holder. Looking forward to hearing him, a true civil rights warrior and someone who has protected voting rights for a very long time. I'm here on behalf of Ben & Jerry's and Advancement Project. For those who don't know Advancement Project, we are a racial justice organization that supports grassroots organizations in dismantling structural racism. Our work is in the area of voting rights. Been doing that since the 2000 debacle in Florida, but also we do work around voter ID and beating back some of the new tools of voter suppression. We also do a lot of work on criminal justice issues, immigrant justice issues, education, and criminal justice. Our partnership with Ben & Jerry's really has centered around our criminal justice issues. We are currently working with them to close a jail in St. Louis called the Workhouse, and we're part of the Close the Workhouse campaign. It's a jail where 95% of the people in that jail are there because they can't afford bail. We intend to close it down and repurpose that money so that that money can be put back into the community for jobs and housing and the supports that people need. We're also working with them to take money from police and schools in Miami-Dade and put that money back into supports for young people. We know that too many school districts across the country are criminalizing young people instead of supporting them. And so with our partner Power U, Ben & Jerry's has been helping us on a campaign to reinvest in young people and divest from criminalization. We have an incredible partnership, and I'm really excited that you all are going to be able to taste our flavor of ice cream. Advancement Project and Ben & Jerry's have a flavor which is called Justice Remixed. It is very good ice cream. We're excited. It was launched about a month ago, and you should look for it in your stores. Proceeds come to Advancement Project to support our work, and so I know you will love it, you will enjoy it, and then make sure you go out and buy some more of it. So thank you again, and enjoy the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Judith. So I'm going to get out of your way and bring up Ari Berman, who is a senior reporter with Mother Jones, has been writing about voting rights, voter suppression, and minority rule for many years. He's one of the few reporters who are doing this work on this issue full-time, and he's also the author of an extraordinary book that you'll be able to get him to sign for you or your mother or your brother-in-law after the show out there. And he will be talking, of course, to a man who is doing something, who's engaged in a fight this year that may be even more important than the fight for the White House. And before you throw things at me for saying that, I'm going to get off and hand this over to Ari. Come on up, Ari.
Good evening. Thank you all for coming. I'm very excited to be here for what I know will be a very timely conversation with Attorney General Eric Holder. Is my mic working okay? All good? Okay, perfect. So without further ado, please welcome Eric Holder to the stage.
All right, first, where's my ice cream? All we have is water. Where's the ice cream?
Gotta talk, you gotta earn that ice cream.
Oh, man.
Only an hour and 26 minutes, then you'll get it.
I thought I'd done enough, man, you know, really? Okay.
I gotta introduce you first, though.
Oh,
you don't really
okay.
need an introduction, but I'm gonna introduce you anyway. So Eric Holder is chairman of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, which fights Republican gerrymandering efforts and advocates for fair maps. Of course, you all know him as the 82nd Attorney General of the United States from 2009 to 2015, the third longest serving Attorney General in the United States, which I did not know, and the first African American Attorney General, which of course we all know. Including his tenure as Attorney General, Eric has served in government for more than 30 years, having been appointed to various positions requiring Senate confirmation by Presidents Obama, Clinton, and Reagan. He began his legal career at the Public Integrity Section of the Justice Department. In 1988, President Reagan appointed him to serve as judge of the Superior Court of the District of Columbia. In 1993, Eric stepped down from the bench to accept an appointment from President Clinton as United States Attorney from the District of Columbia. He held that position until he became the first African-American Deputy Attorney General in 1997. From 2001 until his time as Attorney General, Eric was partner at Covington and Burling, where he is now a partner today. He was born in the Bronx, grew up in Queens. He holds his undergraduate and law degrees from Columbia University, and like me, he is a long-suffering Knicks fan.
Long-suffering.
Although at least you were alive for the titles.
Yeah.
And before we get into it, I just want to mention that I wrote about Eric Holder's work fighting gerrymandering in the recent issue of Mother Jones, and if you want to search for it online, I think the headline of the piece is, "The Courts Won't Fix Gerrymandering. Eric Holder has a plan to fight it anyway," or something like that. So you can check out that article, but we'll be talking about that tonight. So we are going to get into all of the voting rights issues in the country, but I want to start with the topic that's on everyone's mind. Did you ever think you'd see an attorney general that was worse than Jeff Sessions?
No. And yet I think, and this is a difficult thing to say, because I understand that it's a tough job, and in the same way that President Obama, I think, has shown a reluctance to criticize his successor in the way that George W. Bush, I think very admirably, did not criticize President Obama. It's a hard thing to say, and yet I have already tweeted. I think that Barr is unfit for the job. You know, he is a person who has not stood up for the people, the career folks in the Justice Department, FBI, main justice, thinks of himself, I think, as Trump's lawyer, as opposed to the lawyer for the people of the United States. And then the actions that he's taken, I guess, in the recent past, flying around the world, trying to, I guess, somehow substantiate these crazy conspiracy theories is totally inconsistent with what I think an attorney general should be focused on. So Sessions, I thought was, pretty bad, but I think Barr has gone below that.
Do you think Barr should resign?
In an ideal world, if he were a part of a group of people who would resign, I think that'd be a good thing. Because I think we see, that what I would call almost dereliction of duty, that actions, again, inconsistent with the oaths that they have taken, not only at justice, but at state, various parts of the executive branch at the White House. This is an administration unlike any other. I have been in this town since 1976, served under Republican as well as Democratic presidents in various jobs that I've had in the Justice Department, and I've never ever seen anything like we are in the process of experiencing.
Then how do you hold the Attorney General accountable?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, Ari, because all the norms that would hold a cabinet member accountable, subpoenas, hearings. I mean, fast and furious. I went up there with never getting a subpoena. They call me up there and I testify. I testified like 8 times. We turned over 7,000 pages of documents. We made other people available. Didn't think it was fair, but thought that's the way in which, that's a norm. That's the way the branches interact with one another. These guys, send them a subpoena, ignore it. Request for testimony, ignore it. Documents request, ignore it. So it's hard to say, how do you hold them accountable? I think that you got to keep trying. You got to go through the courts, I guess, to force the kinds of things that should happen voluntarily. There has to be a media strategy. I think, the media has to play a role. But then I think that we as citizens also have to be engaged in a way that perhaps we have not been before. We can't wait for the cavalry to come and rescue us from this situation. We are the cavalry. I mean, the American people are the cavalry, and we have to be engaged to a much greater degree than we normally are.
So you mentioned Fast and Furious, and I was scanning right-wing media yesterday, which is always a scary thing in this day and age, and they were talking about that, and they were saying Democrats are hypocrites because when he was Attorney General, Eric Holder didn't hand over all these documents, and that's why the Republican House held him in contempt of Congress, which at the time was the first for a sitting cabinet official. So how is what they accused you of doing different than what this administration is doing right now?
Yeah, well, we didn't turn over certain documents. As I said, we turned over about 8,000 pages worth of documents. The things we did not turn over were internal deliberations about papers that reflected that. How were we going to respond to Congress as opposed to the substance? Went to court. Judge ruled one way or the other. When Sessions came in, he released all of the documents that we decided to withhold, and lo and behold, there was nothing there other than deliberative material. Anything with regard to substance, though, we turned over. The contempt that they held me in was because the gun lobby decided that they wanted to get this attorney general. They wanted to get me. And so, they held me in contempt. And guess what? They held me in contempt out of whatever day it was, and you know what happened the next morning?
What?
I woke up as Attorney General of the United States. And so it's, it was something I took seriously, I thought was, unfair, but we, I think, acted in a way that was consistent with the norms, that we have. We only held back and asserted executive privilege over those things that we actually think that executive privilege has traditionally been thought to cover.
And what do you think this administration's doing? How are they exerting executive privilege?
Without any regard to how it has typically and traditionally been defined. They are stonewalling Congress. What they're doing is obstructing that which Congress legitimately has the ability, I think the constitutional duty to do. And if you're in the process of thinking about what the impeachment articles will look like, it seems to me that at least one of them, and consistent with what happened with Nixon, will be some kind of obstruction of Congress. I think that would be a legitimate charge.
So you mentioned some of the things that Attorney General Barr has done. It seems like he was in on the effort to try to pressure the Ukrainians to investigate Joe Biden. He obviously misstated the findings of the Mueller report. He seems to be traveling all over the world trying to discredit the intelligence agencies. I mean, I think sometimes overuse the word unprecedented, but I mean, this really does feel unprecedented. How does his conduct differ from past attorney generals?
Well, it's unprecedented, It's, it really is the kind of thing where you look for comparisons, you look for historical similarities, and a lot of this stuff is just things we've never seen before. I have a fair sense of history, and I think a particular sense of history when it comes to attorneys general. And, we've not had all great attorneys general. A couple have been convicted, a couple went to jail during the Nixon years. But even there, it's an interesting thing. Even during the height of Watergate, Nixon was still responding to, in fits and starts, and trying to, he knew that there were norms that he couldn't break, so he was trying to figure out ways in which he could deal with those norms, turn over information in a way that wouldn't necessarily harm him until ultimately, the smoking gun tape comes out. And those attorneys general, again, respected in some way, to some degree, the norms. This administration, this Justice Department, fundamentally different. And the thing that is kind of disturbing to me, and I don't know exactly what the genesis of it is that it seems that the Office of Legal Counsel within the Justice Department, that is the part of the department that really opines on, a whole variety of things, what's legal, what's not, what the obligations are, what's not, seems to be supplying the legal bases for the actions that various departments within the executive branch are using. So it's, an OLC has typically been seen as a part of the Justice Department that is non-political, that simply gives legal opinions, and they seem to be kind of drawn into this whole Trumpian mess. I'm
glad you mentioned that because this came up during the Mueller report, that Robert Mueller believed he couldn't indict Donald Trump because of an OLC opinion saying that a sitting president can't be indicted. And I believe that was a memo that dated from the Clinton era. So do you think Mueller correctly interpreted that? Do you think the OLC opinion should have been changed? And should Trump have been indicted back then for obstruction of justice? Well, I think it's interesting. That's a multi-part question. I think Bob Mueller did, probably the right thing in the sense that he respected the finding or the determination by the Office of Legal Counsel that a sitting president cannot be indicted. And from his view, as he's explained, that it wouldn't be fair to say, if I could have indicted the president, I would have said
these things in the indictment. And then the president doesn't really, it's unfair in some way because the president doesn't have an ability to respond in the same way that Bob did. Now, having said that, it was interesting. I accepted that. I think Mueller accepted that. And I heard Barr say, well, no, actually, Bob Mueller could have said, if he wanted to, what charges he would have brought. I'm thinking, well, that's interesting. I don't think that those OLC opinions, there are two of them, are correct. You know, it seems to me that if you look at the base, what underlies that conclusion, it's that, well, if the president, and it's kind of boiling this down, if the president is indicted, he or she will have to spend so much time in the defense of the case that you would paralyze the executive branch. And, you know, for any number of reasons, I don't think that that's right. First off, you know, presidents can do more than one thing at the same time. Most presidents can. And then if the founders have put in place this notion of impeachment, that is something that I think would be equally paralyzing, and yet they thought, well, that's something that we ought to be able to do. You know, the opinion doesn't take into consideration the possibility of the 25th Amendment. The president could absent himself from his duties while he was in the process of defending herself against the criminal charges, and then reassume the office, assume that he or she had been she had been acquitted. So I don't think the opinion really stands the tests that the way in which it ought to be examined. But I do think that Bob Mueller did the right thing in the way that he conducted the investigation and didn't ultimately say outright, I could have indicted on these charges.
Do you think impeachment is warranted based on the evidence we have so far?
You're going to ask me a hard question? Yeah, I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, I think that, you know, as much grief as the Mueller report got, you know, most people didn't read it. And if you looked at, you know, forget the collusion, conspiracy part of it, and just look at the obstruction part, there were 10 specifications of obstruction there. I say there were 4 of them that were any, you know, novice prosecutor would have indicted. So I think that you certainly had a basis there. The president is individual 1 in the Michael Cohen case, you know, the campaign finance violation case in New York. And now we've got Ukraine and all that, as that is starting to play out. So is there a basis for impeachment? I think there's no question about that.
And do you think Democrats are handling this the right way? Should it be purely focused on Ukraine, or should it get into the other issues you raised? Individual 1, Russia. People are talking about other issues as well with his finances and his family's finances. Should it get into all that, or just stick with Ukraine?
I mean, I'd make Ukraine probably the focus. That seems to be the thing that resonates most with people. And we have to understand that this is a political process. For the process to be a successful one, it seems to me you've got to generate public support. People get that. People kind of can understand what Ukraine is all about. But I think this is also a historical process that we are engaged in, and we have to look at precedents that will be set. And so I think that including maybe just a couple of those obstruction specifications, and including the campaign finance matter that's in the Southern District of New York, coupled with whatever comes out of Ukraine, I think that's a pretty compact impeachment case that the House could present to the Senate for their determination.
So Trump's lawyer took the position today in court that even if the president shot someone on Fifth Avenue, he couldn't be criminally prosecuted while being a sitting president.
Yeah.
What do you think of that legal argument?
No, I've looked at the papers that they filed, and it really doesn't pass the laugh test. I mean, I actually would be a little concerned, and I say this half jokingly, but only half jokingly. I'd actually be a little concerned if I were a lawyer having filed a document like that I might be brought up on some kind of disciplinary charges. I mean, it is so bereft of a legal basis, any kind of historical basis. You know, the notion, I mean, they went so far as to say the president cannot be indicted or even examined for anything. I mean, it's totally inconsistent with, you know, the Clinton findings, the Nixon determination, and goes even so far as to say those associated with the president can't be investigated, can't be charged while he's in office. There's absolutely no basis for that. My guess would be that the Second Circuit will make short, do this in a short period of time and just do away with that. And I'd be surprised if the Supreme Court even takes the case.
One more question I want to ask you in this vein. Do you think that James Comey handled the investigation into Hillary Clinton's emails properly? And was there anything Loretta Lynch, who took over for you, could have done to restrain him, either in terms of the press conference he held where he didn't charge Clinton but spent a lot of time talking about her supposed violations, or his decision to then very publicly reopen the investigation 10 days before the election?
Yeah, I mean, I wrote a piece about that, I guess, at the time. And again, it's a difficult thing. I'd known Jim Comey for, 20, 25 years. He's a good man. He's a person of integrity, but, good men make mistakes. And that was a really substantial mistake in holding that press conference. And the head of the FBI, telling the nation that we've made a determination not to proceed against Hillary Clinton. However, and then lay out all these, things, all these negative conclusions about her conduct. First, the Attorney General of the United States or somebody from Main Justice should have been the person who held that press conference, and it should not have contained all of the information. The Justice Department speaks by saying, we're going to charge you or not charge you, and if we're going to charge you, we then lay out what we're going to say in an indictment. If we're not going to charge you, we don't say, we're not charging you, but if we were, we would have, brought these charges. And so I think that, I'd like to think that if I were Attorney General and I heard that Jim Comey was going to hold a press conference and say what he said, that I would have been on the phone, or somebody on my staff would have been on the phone to say, under no circumstances are you to approach a podium and say what you're planning on saying.
Why don't you think Loretta Lynch did that?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I've not spoken to her. I don't know what the dynamics were. I don't know how much notice she had, but that would have been something, that would have been a full alarm on the 5th floor of the Justice Department if I'd heard about something like that, and I would have tried to stop it if I could.
So I want to pull back a little bit and talk a little bit about your own life story. Okay. So you grew up in the 1960s. How did the civil rights movement,
I'm not that old. Yeah, I did grow up in the 1960s, yes.
You were alive in the 1960s,
yes,
right?
Yes, I was.
Okay. That's not fake news.
That's right.
Okay. When did you become aware of the civil rights movement, and how did it impact you?
That's an interesting question. My parents are from Barbados in the West Indies, and my familiarity with or consciousness about the civil rights movement comes, I guess, in two ways. First, everything that was going on in the United States with Freedom Riders, the efforts to integrate the universities in the South, but also as African and Caribbean countries were becoming independent. And so in both of those ways, in the early 60s, that's when, I guess, my consciousness about civil rights began. One of those, as you know, one of the people who integrated the University of Alabama in 1963, when I was 12 years old, was my late sister-in-law, Vivian Malone. When George Wallace stood in the door of the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa, she was one of the two black students who integrated the university. Little did I know that, many years later I would marry her, her sister.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that. So how did your sister-in-law, Vivian Malone Jones, how did she impact your views on civil rights?
Well, it's interesting. First, I remember watching this, on a little black and white TV. They had black and white TVs back then. It was probably about this big, and a screen was like about that big. And I remember watching this young woman with a great deal of poise, walking in past, with the troops around her after the Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach had confronted Wallace. I mean, I can remember all of this stuff. And Vivian graduated and then worked on a voter rights project, and actually worked in the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. And so, we talked about this, and I thought about, I think about her often, and I certainly thought about her when I was being sworn in as AG, and regretting the fact that she did not live long enough to see her brother-in-law. And we were very close. She didn't live long enough to see me be sworn in.
There's a remarkable scene that I tell in my book. When you go down to Selma, Alabama, the birthplace in many ways of the Voting Rights Act, after Obama's election. You've been sworn in as the first black attorney general, and you speak at Brown Chapel Church, which is the church where Martin Luther King and John Lewis and the civil rights movement really use as their base during the demonstrations and use as their base on Bloody Sunday. And you're in the church, you're sitting next to John Lewis, and you're introduced by Peggy Wallace Kennedy, George Wallace's daughter.
Right.
That is such a remarkable moment to me.
Yeah.
What did it feel like at the time?
It was a pretty amazing thing to be at that place and then to be introduced by, George Wallace's daughter, who, has really taken herself in a different place than her dad was. I mean, she was a Barack Obama supporter. And
it all comes full circle.
Full circle. And it was really interesting to be able to talk to her, get to know her. I saw her just actually a few weeks ago. She got another award here in Washington, D.C. She's a wonderful woman. And it was also interesting to see the change that happened with George Wallace, where he asked Vivian Malone, my sister-in-law, they were at an event or something in Alabama, and he asked her to forgive him. And Vivian's a very spiritual person, very religious person. He said, there's no reason for me to forgive you. You did what you had to do. I did what I had to do, and life went on. The question is, where are you now? And I think, Vivian was of the view that Wallace was in a different place at the end of his life.
And you said something that was really interesting in that speech in 2009. I'm just going to read what you said. You said, some take a view that when it comes to civil rights, we have already reached the promised land, but we know better. And some take a view that justice and equality have been achieved for all Americans, but I know better. And there was an interesting thing that happened after the election of Barack Obama, which is that people pointed to the election of the first black president as a reason why we didn't need things like the Voting Rights Act anymore. Did you anticipate that argument being used, and do you think it was an effective argument?
Yeah, I mean, I thought we would hear that, and we would hear also, well, you say there's still the need for civil rights legislation, still a need to focus on civil rights issues. Well, wait a minute, you've got a black president, you've got a black attorney general. But I knew that as significant as that was, and we should not diminish the importance of that. The election of the first African-American president, that's a marker of progress for our country. But it didn't mean that discrimination had been wiped out, that racism had been wiped out, that sexism had been wiped out, or that members of the LGBTQ community were no longer going to be discriminated against. Those problems were still there. What it meant was that we had made progress, and that we had in place people who brought different experiences, different life experiences to the jobs that they held. And I hope that those life experiences maybe made us a little more sensitive than some of our predecessors might have been, and hopefully, more effective. But I was never under the illusion that we were in a post-racial society. I remember hearing that phrase all the time and thinking, really? I don't think that black folks who'd been enslaved for 250 years, dealt with 100 years of Jim Crow, thought that the election of a black president, as significant as that was, necessarily meant that all things were going to be just fine.
So after the 2010 election, the Tea Party wave, when Republicans took over places like Wisconsin and Ohio and Pennsylvania, we saw a wave of new voting restrictions, voter ID laws, cutbacks to early voting, closing of polling places, disenfranchising ex-offenders. I mean, not one or two of these, but a whole sweep of these things. Right. Did you anticipate that the backlash against the first black president was going to take that form? And how did that change your tenure as Attorney General?
Well, it certainly, I think, disabused people of the notion that we were in a post-racial society, I mean, it was literally, Barack Obama sworn in January, 2009, November of 2010, we have this, as he described then, this shellacking and the rise of the Tea Party movement. And then, as you said, all of those things put in place. And I think made very clear that we were in for a battle. Now, I was a little surprised at the breadth of things that were done, the intensity of negative feeling that was directed at the president, at me, at the administration, and I realized, almost to my disappointment, to my dismay, that this was going to be a real fight. That I thought that at a minimum we would have a period, an era of some period of good feeling, because he won a pretty smashing victory, but the good feeling that might have been generated by that on inauguration day dissipated relatively quickly, and people retreated to their corners. The Tea Party became a force in the Republican Party and pushed it further and further to the right with just crazy, conspiracy theories and crazy notions of what the Affordable Care Act was all about, which had and then, put all these voter suppression mechanisms in place, to try to maintain power. I think, the establishment, the Republican establishment, felt very threatened by Barack. Not necessarily in a racial way, although there might have been an element of that for some, but he represented and continues to represent a new America. And that's what worried them, The Obama coalition, which is the coming demography of this nation, threatens this entrenched and old, ossified, Republican establishment. And they decided that they were going to do all that they could to hold on to power.
The Supreme Court case that gutted the Voting Rights Act in 2013 is called Shelby County versus Holder.
We only call it the Shelby County case. That's like having your name on the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott versus Holder. It's just the Shelby County case.
What was that decision like for you personally, as the first Black Attorney General, for that to happen under your watch? And how did it change? How did it take away your ability to stop these suppressive tactics in places like Texas and North Carolina?
Yeah. It's interesting. I was a little naive. I actually thought that in spite of what our really great Solicitor General, Don Verrilli, was telling me about how he thought the case was going to turn out, I thought that given the action that Congress had taken in terms of the number of hearings that they had held, the findings that Congress had made, the fact that the Voting Rights Act had been reauthorized by, a Republican president, George Bush, that I didn't think the court would go there. I just didn't think, and Don kept saying, boy, are you naive. And when the opinion came down, 5-4, and he looked at the language that I guess the Chief Justice wrote, it was disheartening, it was disappointing, but it steeled my resolve that this is not something that we can simply, all right, here we go, I come from a people who are used to these kinds of things, And life's never easy if you're a person of color in this country. All right, you're going to make it difficult. Got that. I know how to deal with that. And so I remember we brought together on the 5th floor of the Justice Department, that's where the Attorney General's office is, a big conference room, brought together the heads of a whole variety of civil rights organizations, and the day after to say, disagree with the Shelby County case. Voting Rights Act has been gutted. Section 2 of the act still remains, and we're going to use whatever mechanisms we can to fight all the things that this decision undoubtedly will allow the states to do. And it didn't take, but a few weeks before the states really took advantage of what the Supreme Court allowed them to do to put in place even more draconian voter suppression measures.
And it's worth noting that today, the House Judiciary Committee actually passed a bill called the Voting Rights Advancement Act that would restore and even expand the Voting Rights Act. So it seems like at least House Democrats are committed to trying to strengthen this law once again.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you've got to have a restructured Voting Rights Act. It's necessary for the Justice Department to have the ability to stop things that, through the pre-clearance process, stop things as they are proposed and before they're put in place, as opposed to now, where the Justice Department almost has little ability other than to file suits after things, have occurred, after people have voted in systems that are drawn in districts that are drawn improperly, racially gerrymandered, whatever. The preclearance process allowed the Justice Department to stop things before, wrong as they might have been before they were actually put into place. But I think one thing that needs to happen in a new act is that we had to cover jurisdictions that were essentially, the old South, and some, bits and pieces of the North. I think this is an act that should be nationwide in its coverage because we see problems with regard to voter suppression, not restricted to the South, but in Wisconsin, in Ohio, in Michigan. These are problems that are nationwide in scope, not only ones that you find in the South.
I think what the new bill is doing is it's requiring states that have a recent history of discrimination, so going back 25 years, they have to approve all their changes with the federal government. But then any state, if they have a suppressive law they want to put into effect, like a voter ID law or closing a polling place or cutting early voting, that state, even if they're not under quote-unquote pre-clearance, they have to get those changes approved. So it would, in fact, I guess, in that way cover all 50 states.
Right, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's H.R. 4, and I hope that this Senate will not obviously take it up. Mitch McConnell's not going to take that law and consider it. My hope would be
You don't think so?
I will bet anything on that one. That's not going to happen. But my hope would be that Democrats will maintain control of the House, that this could be reintroduced, and that hopefully with a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president, that bill could be put into law.
Let's talk about what you're focusing on today. So gerrymandering.
Right.
People think of it as this very dry, obscure, wonky issue. Why did you want to make that your central focus of your post-attorney generalship?
Because I'm a dry, wonky guy. No. I'm a fun guy. Well, it's interesting. It is kind of a wonky thing, but it is a consequential thing. I mean, if you care about protecting women's reproductive rights, if you care about sane gun laws, if you care about the climate, if you care about protecting people's right to vote, if you care about health care, these are all things that are totally impacted by gerrymandering. I mean, these crazy laws that you see, I don't know, from anywhere from guns to heartbeat bills, to all the voter suppression things, they come from these gerrymandered states. It's not a coincidence that you see the greatest amount of voter suppression where you see the greatest amount of gerrymandering, Wisconsin, North Carolina, other states. And it seemed to me that this was just a continuation of that which I'd made one of my focuses as Attorney General, protection of the right to vote. As Barack Obama and I were discussing what did we want to do in our post-government lives, we decided to focus on this issue of gerrymandering, which, frankly, Democrats had not focused on. In 2011, the last time, we have a census in 2010, another one in 2020, then we redistricted. In 2011, we'll redistrict again in 2021. Democrats didn't focus in 2011 on this process to the same degree that Republicans did, and they cleaned our clocks. And
why didn't they focus on it?
I think we were still in the glow of we've got a black president, we were still feeling good about, his swearing in 2009, and we just didn't focus, we focused on the presidency as opposed to what was going on in the states. And that's another thing that worries me about this present situation. All presidential elections are important. This next presidential election is of existential importance. Existential. Donald Trump cannot be reelected. That cannot happen. But in focusing our efforts in defeating him and denying him a second term, we can't lose sight of what's going to happen at the state and local level. We have to make sure that we win everywhere, run good, strong progressives, Democrats in all races at the local level, county level, at the state level, and try to take back some of those states that were so badly gerrymandered in 2011, and then stop the passage of, again, these kind of, just crazy bills that are unsupported by the American people. And that's, I think, that people need to understand. 80-90% of the American people want to have expanded background checks, want to reduce the size of magazines that you can sell, ban assault weapons. And yet, That doesn't happen by a gerrymandered jurisdictions around the country. So politicians are allowed to do things that are inconsistent with the desires of the people who they supposedly serve, but they don't suffer any electoral consequence because of gerrymandering. So that's why. It's wonky, it's dry, but it's vitally important to the health of our democracy. And what I said, I guess when we started the effort in January of 2017, I said it was my job to try to make gerrymandering or redistricting sexy. So,
You don't have a centerfold, but
no,
you're doing your best.
we're doing our best, yeah.
So-
And, so people, wonky and all that stuff. And so, what I try to tell people, all right, I try to, you break down what is gerrymandering, what is redistricting. I start with a basic premise now, which is that gerrymandering is cheating. All right, you start there, and then you explain from there, and that kind of gets people to understand, so it's wrong, it's cheating. So that's the elevator speech starts there.
Well, a lot of people feel like gerrymandering makes their vote useless because you look at a place like Wisconsin. In 2018, in the state assembly in Wisconsin, Republicans got 46% of votes, but 64% of seats.
Right.
So it feels like no matter who is getting the most votes, the party that draws the districts is staying in power.
Yep.
But you looked at that situation and you thought, it's not hopeless, there's something we can do about it. What did you feel like you could do about it to fight this that wasn't already being done?
Sure. Well, there are usually three institutions, bodies that are involved in the redistricting process, both houses of the legislature and the governor. And so what we decided is if we can control one of those three, that will mean that Democrats will be at the table when it comes to drawing the lines. If in Wisconsin, for instance, we were not able to take either of the houses, we did elect Tony Evers, who's now the governor of Wisconsin. And will be, there we go. And will be the governor when the redistricting is done. And so he will have the ability to look at what the Republican legislature does and veto it. And if he vetoes it and there's not a way in which they can come to a compromise, well, then the courts will actually have to draw the lines. And we've done very well when judges, fairly neutral bodies, actually do the line drawing. So we look for ways in which we can break up what are these so-called Republican trifectas, where they control the governorship and then both houses of the state legislature. And so that's what we have tried. We've targeted states and then targeted races. Like in Texas, we think we have a shot. Yeah, we think we have a shot at winning the State House of Representatives. We flipped 12 seats in 2018. We need 9 in 2020, and that would give Democrats a seat at the table when it comes to redistricting in Texas.
But is there a tension between trying to elect more Democrats and pass fair maps? What if the Democrats just get in there and they draw a Democratic gerrymander to replace a Republican gerrymander? Is that a good outcome for democracy?
That's not a good outcome, and that's not what this effort is about. I would not have put my name on this. Barack would not have put his name. President Obama would not have put his name on this. This is not an effort to gerrymander for Democrats. This is an effort to promote fairness in our system. As an example, in Colorado, where there is a Democratic trifecta, Democratic governor, we control both of the houses there, and they will probably get another seat as a result of the census and how that has to be done, another congressional seat. Well, Democrats there could think about gerrymandering, and what did Democrats there do? They pushed for the creation of a nonpartisan commission. Take it out of the hands of politicians and let a commission draw the lines. And so, and when we had Democrats in New Jersey who wanted to use the power that they had there in a Democratic state to do some gerrymandering, I very publicly said no. That was wrong. I would not support that. And along with the governor, Phil Murphy, we made Democrats there stand down. So this is not an attempt to pervert the system on behalf of Democrats to do something partisan there. Because I think if it's a fair system, if it's a fair fight, Democrats and progressives will do just fine. That's what Republicans don't want to have. They don't think that they can win.
In June, the Supreme Court ruled that federal courts can't review partisan gerrymandering cases, which I said at the time was a doomsday situation for voting rights. I mean, honestly, that was the most radical position they could have possibly taken in that case. How does that change your strategy if you can't sue in Wisconsin and Michigan and North Carolina and all these other places in federal court?
Well, we've got a multi-pronged strategy. We try to elect people so that we break up those trifectas, try to take over one of the houses there, so there's direct electoral support. We support the creation of these nonpartisan commissions. We also have a big advocacy effort to make sure that people are involved in this and making sure that this is as transparent a process as is possible. And now the federal courts are not open to us when it comes to bringing partisan gerrymandering cases. We can still bring racial gerrymandering cases in federal court, and very often there is an overlay between that which is racial and that which is partisan.
And let's just define that for people. So if you're drawing a district and you're saying you're drawing a district to try, let's say you're a Republican and you don't want a Democrat to be elected, that's thought of as partisan gerrymandering. But if you draw a district that prevents or dismantles a district that could elect an African American or a Latino or an Asian American, that's racial gerrymandering.
Right. Or if you decide, because African Americans vote overwhelmingly for Democrats, you decide to pack African Americans into one district, therefore decreasing their ability to exercise political power in other parts of the state, or you crack the African American population, disperse them so that they can't be they can't exert power. That is racial gerrymandering as well, although it will look like, they will say, well, no, it's not racial, it's partisan, that what we're doing here. And so our job then is to convince courts that it is not a partisan gerrymander, it is a racial one. But we also have the ability to bring these partisan gerrymandering cases in state courts, using the state constitutions, as we just recently did in North Carolina, where we won a victory where the state Supreme Court there said that actually not a state court, but a three-judge panel said that what the Republicans had done there on a partisan gerrymandering basis was inconsistent with the North Carolina state constitution, and they had to redraw the lines.
And one of the things that I was interesting about that decision was it was a very thorough decision. It was like
259 pages, something like that.
They said that the North Carolina state constitution had better protections for voting rights than the federal constitution. Because remember, there is no federal guarantee of a right to vote in this country. So, and apparently a lot of other state constitutions have similar language protecting voting rights. So do you foresee filing more litigation in state courts now?
Yeah, I think we will. I mean, if we'd gotten an appropriate decision from the United States Supreme Court, it would have been relatively easy to bring these cases and say, well, the United States Supreme Court says that you can't gerrymander on a partisan basis. Court says federal courts are not open to that. So it means there's going to be a slog. We'll have to go, state by state, but I expect that we'll bring more cases like we brought in North Carolina, more cases like the one that was brought in Pennsylvania on the basis of the state constitutions.
And you're now suing to get rid of the North Carolina congressional maps in state court.
We won at the state level, and now we, in North Carolina, suing to get the North Carolina congressional delegation to more accurately reflect the votes of people in that state. It's an interesting thing. The first part of the complaint in the case that we filed quotes a legislator in North Carolina, a Republican legislator, who says it's about a 50-50 state, but there are now 10 Republican congressmen, 3 Democrats. And so they asked him, well, it's 10-3. Why is it 10-3? And he said, well, because we couldn't make it 11-2. I mean, he actually said that, and that is actually, I think, in the third paragraph of our complaint, to say, you want to know what we're dealing with? Look at this guy's words.
That same legislator also said, I want to make it very clear I am doing a partisan gerrymander.
Right. Yeah.
Because he wanted to avoid a racial gerrymander, but of course that seems like language the courts might be interested in.
So this was exactly, he said this was not a racial gerrymander, it was a partisan gerrymander. And it was like, okay, I think that's paragraph 5 that we have.
So you mentioned the state legislative elections. Some of them are happening in 2019 in places like Virginia, but also the bulk of them are happening in 2020. And this is going to determine, after the next census, what the districts look like for the next decade. And one of my fears, I think it's one of your fears, is that these races which are critically important for democracy, are being totally overshadowed by the presidential campaign. Right. How worried are you about that?
I'm very worried about that. As I said, the presidential election is of existential importance, but these state races are, if not existential in their importance, they are more important than I think any state races have perhaps ever been. I can't imagine what this country will look like if we have 20 years of gerrymandered Republican control, and we try to dislodge it in 2031 as opposed to 2021. It's going to be difficult enough in 2021, but I think it's doable. I think we will do it. But to have to go through another 10 years of what we have experienced in this decade would be, I think, could be disastrous for our democracy.
We were in Wisconsin together in April, and there was a very important state Supreme Court race in Wisconsin that right now, in April, Republicans had a majority on the state Supreme Court, but Democrats needed to win 2 more seats, starting with this race in April, to take back control of the Wisconsin Supreme Court, which of course oversees voting laws and a lot of other stuff. And they're not Republicans and Democrats, but just for the purpose of this, we'll say it. The Republican candidate was Scott Walker's former lawyer.
Right.
And the Democratic candidate was a well-respected judge. And you campaigned for the Democratic candidate.
Right.
But you were the only major Democrat to go to Wisconsin to campaign for her.
It got a little, I think in the article, you quoted me, I said I felt a little lonely there, you know. The national Democrats had not focused on that race, had not focused either when I was in Texas in 2018 campaigning for state candidates where we picked up, 12 seats. And if we're going to be successful, national Democratic organizations have got to, and there are, national Democratic organizations who are charged with the responsibility of working at the state level, but they need to be adequately funded. They need to get the necessary attention. They need to be adequately resourced. And what happened in that race was that the Democratic candidate was up in the polls 10 days out or so, and then the Republicans spent, I think, $1.4 million in the last week, ran ads with my face in them and said, don't let Eric Holder come in and, reshape the Wisconsin Supreme Court. I mean, it was put up pictures of Justice Kennedy and Justice Kavanaugh and Donald Trump and said, don't let them do to this person who's running, I guess his name is Hagedorn. Don't let what's happening to Judge Hagedorn that happened to, Justice Kavanaugh. It was pretty interesting, and I think eye-opening for, I hope, a lot of people to understand that you have to have more than just the National Democratic Redistricting Committee, the former Attorney General. This is an all-hands effort that we have to be engaged in.
And the Republican candidate won by 6,000 votes.
6,000 votes,
which was a very close election. Yeah. It just seems to me that if all gerrymandering cases are now going to be heard in state courts, all partisan gerrymandering cases are going to be heard in state courts, Democrats really have to have a strategy to think about the state courts.
Yeah, I mean, where there are elections, we've got to play in those elections where the governor is the person who appoints people to the court. That is one more reason to be engaged in governor races. So there's a whole bunch of reasons why you've got to look at all the levers, all the things that have an impact on fair redistricting, and then make sure that you are, playing in each of those components.
What are the states you're focusing on this year and next year?
2019, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Virginia.
What are the elections in those places?
Well, in Louisiana, we are looking at the governor's race. The Democratic governor there, Governor Edwards, John Bel Edwards, is now in a runoff election that I think is held mid-November or so. So we'll be trying to focus on that. In Virginia, we are focused on the legislature. We have, I guess, 2 seats in each chamber that need to be flipped, and I think we can do that and then actually take control of the legislature. We've already got a Democratic governor there. So for those of you who live in Virginia, vote. Get out there and vote. And in Kentucky, we're looking at the governor's race, and so we'll see what happens there.
And it's worth noting the Virginia Assembly last election, they literally drew straws, I think.
Right.
to
Right.
pick who controlled the assembly.
Right, it was a tie.
So, I mean, when people think, does their vote matter?
Right.
That's a pretty good example of how it does.
Well, that's exactly right. I mean, every vote counts, every vote matters, and that is a really stark example of that. We have I think the capacity, the ability to make sure that Governor Edwards is reelected in Louisiana. I think we have the capacity. I think we will flip both of the houses in Virginia. And then in 2020, what we want to do is focus on those Republican trifectas. And these are going to be tough. It's Texas, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, and Ohio. Those are the states that we have to really break up those trifectas.
So after you got the North Carolina state legislative map struck down, the Wall Street Journal called it a redistricting coup. And Scott Walker said you were trying to gerrymander the House for Nancy Pelosi. Is that what you're doing?
Well, with all due, the Wall Street Journal is actually a very good publication, but you got to be careful when you read the editorial page because they're fundamentally different than the reporters. So you take that into account. So no, that's not what we're trying to do. What we're trying to do is to make the system fair. It's simply that. I don't need to cheat. I think if you make the playing field level, as I said before, Democrats and progressives will do just fine. And the fact that, when they criticize me, I said, well, all right, here's the deal. Will you say that you will stand for the creation of these nonpartisan, independent commissions? They never come back with a yes to that. They always say, well, they'll be unfair. Really? They never come up with, they attack, they say Holders and Obama have a budget of $250 million. Like, really? I wish we did have a budget like that. So they come up with, Scott Walker says, well, Holders, the new thing is they sue till you're blue, It's taking us to task for bringing these lawsuits. And my rejoinder to that is, well, if I had their record, I wouldn't want to be in court either, And courts, as I said, tend to treat us pretty well because we have the facts and the law on our side.
Because Scott Walker's now fundraising for a group that's trying to preserve Republican gerrymandering. Right. So you guys seem to be getting into it on Twitter a little bit.
Yeah, every now and again, Scotty will say something, and I'll try. Every fourth or fifth one, I'll send something back at him. He's a pretty easy target.
In fairness, I did notice your tweets had a lot more retweets than his did. So
yeah,
I think he was getting ratioed a little bit more.
Yeah, I got a lot more followers than he does, and with good reason,
So one thing that's been very frustrating to me as a journalist is that there have been 31 presidential debates in 2020 and 2016, but not a single question about voting rights or gerrymandering.
Right.
How do we get people to care about this topic? How do we get the media to care about it, to elevate it to all the other issues that are being discussed? How do we get candidates to elevate it? The Democrats all have good plans on this, but it doesn't seem like they're really making it front and center in terms of how they're campaigning.
Well, we put together a pledge, and every Democratic candidate has signed it, saying that they would try to elevate the issue of gerrymandering and appropriate redistricting in 2021, make voter suppression, fighting against voter suppression, make this a top topic. And I think they're prepared to answer these questions. I don't need to hear about health care anymore. I got it. I know where everybody stands on health care. I know, you give me the candidate, I can tell you where they stand on health care. And, we always hear health care. And it's important. I get that. But I'm as frustrated as you when it comes to the state of our democracy. And what are these candidates going to do? And what are the Republicans going to do when it comes to saving our democracy that is, I think, in peril? And as I said, all the Democrats have signed this pledge. They all have plans. And, when asked about it, very infrequently, not on the debate stage, but in, some reporter, you're talking to them, they'll have good plans, good responses, but there needs to be, those kinds of questions asked when you have the largest audiences, when you have 12 people, 10 people, whatever it is on the debate stage. So my hope would be at this next debate, whenever that is, that some journalist will ask that question of all of the candidates, and we can hear them, give their responses and elevate. That's an important part of this. We have to raise the consciousness of the American people about the importance of this issue.
And it's worth noting the next presidential debate is in Georgia,
right,
where there was rampant voter suppression
right,
in the last election.
Stacey Abrams won that race. All right? We were talking about tweets. The tweet that I did on that, I said something like the race was illegitimate, Stacey Abrams actually won. That tweet was viewed by like 6-7 million people, something like that. That was the most viewed tweet that I've ever done. I am convinced that because of the voter suppression techniques that were used there, the purging of the rolls, the exact match stuff that was done, all of those things that, it's interesting. The guy who's running for governor was the Secretary of State until the last week. So he's like the referee in the game where he is a player. And I am convinced that that Stacey Abrams got, if everything had been done fairly, she got more votes than the person who won, than the guy who's now the governor, Kemp.
Monica, in her introduction, talked about the reporting that I had done on voter suppression in Wisconsin.
Yeah.
And I think if you look at all the data, enough voters were turned away in that one state alone to have impacted the final outcome. Mm-hmm. How concerned are you that history is going to repeat itself in 2020? That what we saw in Georgia in 2018 or what we saw in Wisconsin in 2016 is going to happen again? And do you think Democrats are adequately prepared to deal with this?
I'm very worried about that. I mean, I'm very, very worried about that. I actually think, as I kind of look at the map now, I'm feeling pretty good about Pennsylvania, feeling pretty good, I think, about Michigan. I am very worried about Wisconsin. If Democrats don't win Wisconsin and everything else stayed the same, you would then have a reelected Donald Trump with 270 or 271 electoral votes, and we'd have 268, something like that. So that worries me a great deal, because I think what we saw in 2016 will be done again in 2020. We'll certainly have the Russians, and they'll be doing all that stuff. But in addition to that, voter suppression things, these unnecessary photo ID laws, voting rolls have been purged. The Supreme Court has allowed that to happen. Again, these exact match things. There's a whole range of things that Republicans have put in place to make it more difficult for people to vote. And that is, I think, a defining characteristic of these parties. Democrats say we want as many people to vote as is possible, and we need to make it as easy as it can be for people to vote. And it doesn't mean that because you say that, there's going to be an increase in the amount of what they call, voter fraud. There's no proof of that. Republicans, by contrast, want to choose, want to select who should have the ability to vote, make it more difficult for certain people to vote and get to the polls, their people.
Speaking of 2020, the New York Times had a story yesterday that a lot of people were talking about, where the quote-unquote establishment was fretting about the candidates. Mm-hmm. And they even said that you were considering potentially getting in the ring for president. Is that true?
What's the question? Okay, all right. No, I think we've got a great field of candidates. I think that somebody will emerge. We'll get a good person who will lead the ticket, and I will campaign like hell to get that person elected president of the United States.
So you're not worried about the 2020 field?
Well, worried, yeah. I'm worried that we, make sure we have the right person, that person has adequate resources to run a good campaign, that person can withstand all that's going to come at him or her. This is going to be hell. As bad as 2016 was, and all the unfair shots that were taken at Hillary Clinton, this is going to be like that on steroids. And we've already seen it with regard to attempts to engage a foreign power in the election against the person who I guess Donald Trump perceives as his leading opponent.
I guess today again, Republicans blocked a vote on election security in the Senate.
Yeah.
So we still have not passed any substantive election security legislation other than a few $100 million to the states for some new voting machines.
Yeah, and you think about that. I mean, you think about that. What we had to deal with in 2016, that is documented. The Russians interfered with our election. You listen to the intelligence community, you listen to the head of the FBI, and Bob Mueller said it as well, that they're coming back, that others are going to come back. And Republicans have failed to put in place these measures that are not pro-Democrat, they're not pro-Republican, they're simply protective of our electoral system. And why they would not vote those things, vote favorably for those, it really is amazing to me. I think the concern they have is that if they pass them, doubt will be cast on the legitimacy of the 2016 election, and that Trump will be seen as an illegitimately elected president. I'm not even going to go there. That's fine. He's president. All right, we have to deal with that. But you certainly ought to be protecting the nation from that which we know we're going to have to deal with in 2020.
Mark Zuckerberg was being grilled today on Capitol Hill. What role do you think Facebook plays on this? And also, what do you think about the fact that they're basically saying we're not going to fact check the ads to see if they're true or not, and that they may be worried about potentially being investigated back to the Department of Justice? They may be afraid of being investigated by the Department of Justice if they do something that's thought of as counter to Trump's interest.
It seems to me that companies, individuals, just always need to do the right thing, Who knows, maybe a company will get investigated by the Justice Department. Well, you hire a bunch of good lawyers, I know a few, and to defend you and to push back. You just can't acquiesce or react to fear. You got to stand up. This is our democracy. This is what defines this nation as unique, as consequential, as great. And unless we're willing to stand up for our democracy in all the ways that we can, we'll lose it. This, simply because we've had it for, a couple hundred years, doesn't mean that it's going to be there forever. We could continue to have, elections every 2 years, 4 years, whatever, and they could be rendered almost meaningless unless we stand up for the principles that, at its best, undergird our democracy.
Last thing I want to ask you before we go to some of these questions. I've lost track of when this even was. I think yesterday. Maybe it was today. I think it was yesterday. The president said that he was a victim of a lynching. You're the first African-American attorney general. Yeah. What do you think of that?
I thought that was reprehensible. If you understand the history of lynching in this country, state-sponsored terrorism, if you look at those pictures of lynching, if you look at the picture, I guess it was in Marion, Indiana, 2 black men held up, strung up, lynched, and you see a crowd of white folks looking at the camera and smiling and laughing and pointing at those 2 bodies. You think about the thousands of people who were lynched in this nation. To compare that to a constitutionally mandated or constitutionally authorized process that's underway in our Congress was reprehensible, just awful, inconsistent with what you'd expect a decent person, forget a president, a decent person to say. And if you want to know who this guy is, you look at that. You just look at that. And that is one of the reasons why, you can disagree about tax policy, you can disagree about foreign policy decisions, but that's reflective of who this man is and why he's got to get his ass beaten in 2020.
I got to ask you this. In all your years as a lawyer...
I shouldn't have said ass. I meant to say we should beat him decisively. Yeah, we should whip his ass.
In all your years as a lawyer, did you ever know Rudy Giuliani?
Yeah, I did. I've had interactions with him on a variety of occasions. There was one occasion when he, I guess, was still the mayor, and I was the deputy attorney general, and there was a case we were thinking about bringing against the city of New York. He had just gone through cancer treatments, and he was very jaundiced. And I got to tell you that he made a presentation to me and to then Attorney General Janet Reno that was one of the best presentations I'd ever seen by a lawyer. So he is not a person without legal skills, and the person who I see now seems fundamentally different than the person who I saw then and who I've had, some interactions with. But I can say that about a whole bunch of Republicans who were my opponents, but who I could respect, had different views, and who have lost their bearings, lost their souls in defense of this president. And that's a very distressing thing to see how the morality that existed in the Republican Party has almost been hollowed out by this president.
All right, I want to go to audience questions, and I have some good questions here on index cards, so I'm going to go through them. The first one is from PJ. Why do you feel young people don't vote in high numbers, and what can be done to improve this? You have 3 kids of voting age, so what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think, for young people, and I can't see you all out here, but I assume because we're in a college environment, university environment, you're all distressingly young. Okay, yeah, applaud for being young. Okay, that's good. That you all, this generation, you're now the largest voting bloc in this country. There's more of you than any other bloc, and that you have enormous amounts of political power that needs to be exercised because it's your future that's at stake. Unless we have a successful 2019, 2020, 2021 redistricting effort, climate change won't be addressed. As I said before, these crazy gun laws will be passed. Women's reproductive rights will not be respected. I mean, it's your future, and so it's always distressing to see the level of participation of young people. So what we've tried to do at NDRC in the places that we have targeted is to reach out to young people where they are, go to college campuses. So they put me on internet shows, The Breakfast Club, DeSuze and Merrill, before they went big time. Now they're on Showtime. They are just when they were internet. Places, frankly, these are shows I didn't really know existed, but I went on there. And so we try to meet young people where they are, try to convince them about the power that they have and what's at stake. But I think also there needs to be an understanding, a historical understanding. People died. People sacrificed. People committed themselves to give everyone the right to vote. John Lewis got his skull cracked on the Edmund Pettus Bridge, and those 3 civil rights workers died in Mississippi in 1963. People don't know what they were doing was trying to register people to vote. We dishonor that legacy when we don't vote. And this isn't just at young people. This is just at people generally. Every American, I think, has the civic obligation to vote. And if it means in 2020, because of all the voter suppression, they're going to have to wait in line for 4 hours. We're going to have to find where the polling places are. You think about, all right, that sounds difficult and it sounds unfair, and it is. But you think about what it was like to be, Martin Luther King, John Lewis, Thurgood Marshall, and going into small southern towns and trying to get the right to vote for people. And we don't honor them in the way that we should if we don't take advantage of the opportunities that they gave to us through their sacrifices.
This is another good question. After the rhetoric of rigging by Donald Trump in the 2016 election, how do we restore public faith in the system and avoid reactionary non-participation in the next election? I just want to add one thing to that question, which is, how concerned are you if Trump loses, he's going to claim the election was unfair and refuse to leave office?
there's no question that he will say that it is unfair, that it was rigged, that the deep state had some ability to, rig the election. Not leave office, I don't even want to think about, that possibility. But that's why I think the election has to be as decisive as it possibly can be. Not make this a close election, make this one that, normal, right-thinking people will look at and say, that it wasn't close. You didn't win. Serve until January, 20th, and then, leave us. But I'm worried, what they will do, what he will do to try to ensure that he is reelected, the measures that he will go to. And if there was any doubt about that, you only have to look at what's going on now as these Ukrainian revelations roll out. I mean, again, you have to think about that. This is a president of the United States using his people to get a foreign power to get dirt on his possible opponent. I mean, if you think about high crimes and misdemeanors or things that are inconsistent with the presidential oath of office, that's it.
And some people are actually speculating today that these crazy actions of House Republicans to storm into the classified room and bring their phones in, which you can only imagine if a Democrat had done something like that, that this is all laying the groundwork to claim that not only is the impeachment inquiry illegitimate, but that the election results. This is a preview of the kind of thing we might see if Trump loses the election, there's some dispute over the results.
Yeah. Well, we've seen this before. I don't know if you all were old enough to remember that, during the Bush-Gore election, the recount in Florida, Republicans, conservatives stormed one of those recount offices to make sure that the recount could not go ahead.
The Brooks Brothers riot.
Yeah, the Brooks Brothers riot. I mean, and we've seen this, that was a very distressing thing to see. And I don't think we should underestimate the significance of what we saw today. There's also an element here of trying to distract people. So we're talking about the storming of the place where they were trying to hold the deposition. So we're not focusing on what Ambassador Taylor testified to yesterday. And we got to keep our eyes on the prize. Focus on that. But what they did, we have seen before. We've seen those kinds of tactics in Europe in the 1930s. You see them in so-called third world countries, where again there is a legitimate process that is underway that people who are elected representatives and who know better are trying to use whatever means they can to disrupt the normal operations of government. That was a very distressing, almost frightening thing.
Another question. How can people volunteer to protect voting rights? What can the average person do?
Well, there are organizations. One of them is the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. We have our All on the Line advocacy program, and we're looking for people to work with us to help with regard to the redistricting effort. But there are a whole range of other...
Can I just go back to that? So your operation has merged with Barack Obama's political operation. So explain what that's going to do.
We had, when the president was elected, we had Obama for America, then became Organizing for Action when he was president. That has now been merged into the NDRC and is now called All on the Line. And this is where we gather, we now have hundreds of thousands of citizens around the country that are engaged in our protective redistricting efforts, involved in a way that will guarantee transparency to the process. And we are looking for people, young people, older people, whatever, to be engaged in this effort. And so you can, if you go to our website, you can find us and find ways in which you can be involved. But again,
what's your website?
It's All on the Line. I don't, that's the name of the organization, and Patrick's here somewhere. We'll
announce it by the end.
Okay, good.
allontheline.org.
There we go. And I'm a great leader of this organization. allontheline.org.
I just want to mention a few other voting rights groups that people could check out. There's the Advancement Project.
Right.
Judy is here tonight. Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, Brennan Center for Justice, League of Women Voters, NAACP, NAACP Legal Defense Fund, Leadership Conference on Civil Rights. There's I'm sure I'm forgetting some, but those are places to get started, both to volunteer and also just to research on what's going on.
Right, yep.
I want to ask you about the census. That didn't come up. So there's not going to be a citizenship question on the census.
Right, we sued them and we beat them.
Yes, nice job.
Yeah.
However, I was just in Texas and people are very concerned about the census. They think that a lot of people still believe that question is on the form, and even if it's not on the form, people are just distrustful of what the Trump administration is going to do with the census. So how concerned are you still about the census, and what does the message have to be to get people to fill it out?
Very concerned about the census. I spent a lot of time in Texas where you see voter participation in the Latino community that is distressingly low. And as I talk to voting advocates there, especially young people, about why don't we see greater participation, they say there's a fear that has certainly been generated by this administration. People who live in mixed households with documented and undocumented people are concerned that if they fill out the form, it will expose other people who are undocumented to all the horrors of this administration. And so we have got to the extent that we can, and we're working with other census concerned organizations to reassure people to the extent that we can. But we have to also understand that fear is legitimate. I mean, that is a legitimate fear that these folks have. And so we have to offer as much reassurance as we can, being realistic with them, and be prepared to defend people, documented, undocumented, as they are doing that which the Constitution mandates. The Constitution says that we're supposed to count not all the citizens in this country, but all of the people in this country. And our hope is to have a fair census in 2020, because that is the foundation for a fair redistricting effort in 2021.
Another question. What would be the best solutions to the voting rights problems we've talked about? In an ideal world, what would the ideal voting system look like?
Okay. I think that with regard to redistricting, I think the creation of these commissions, I think that's actually the best way to do it. Take it out of the hands of politicians altogether. Don't let politicians choose their voters. Put in place those kinds of systems. But I think, other than that, I think it really is a question of putting people into decision-making roles who care about our democracy. I'd like to think that this would be a bipartisan issue, a nonpartisan issue, but I think the Republican Party has become comfortable with the notion that it is going to be a minority party that has majority power, that they're okay with that, and that the efforts that we take to try to make the system fair are perceived as partisan because, as I said, I think that necessarily will mean, if they're done fairly, elections will result in a decrease in Republican power. So I think it's just a question of, blocking and tackling, winning elections, winning lawsuits, pushing for these ballot initiatives where we can to put in place these nonpartisan commissions. The mechanisms are there. The question is whether or not organizations that are fighting to put those mechanisms in place will get the necessary support, and whether the American people will ultimately demand the fair system to which they're entitled.
I'll just throw out a few policies that I think are the wave of the future. One is automatic voter registration.
Sure.
I mean, when I turned 18, I was automatically enrolled.
Right.
If there would ever be another draft. So if they know to automatically enroll me to potentially fight a war, they can automatically enroll me to register to vote.
Right.
And if you look at, Oregon became the first state to do this in 2015. And 300,000 people were automatically registered to vote in Oregon when they did this. And Oregon had the highest increase in voter turnout of any state. So Oregon was the first state in 2015. Now 17 states have adopted it. So in a very short period of time, this is one of the reforms that has done really well.
Yeah, I think, the notion of voting by mail, I think is something we ought to consider as well. That's done in Oregon, in a couple of other states as well, and there's no indication that there's any increase in voter fraud or anything like that. I think we shouldn't call it vote by mail, we should call it vote at home. I think that's a better way to sell that concept. I think we also ought to do away with this, these felon disenfranchisement rules, given the sordid history, the sordid basis for the passage of those bills, post-Civil War, trying to find ways in which you could make sure that newly freed people would not have the ability to vote, come up and say, well, if you have a felony record, you can't vote. Sounds kind of neutral on its face. Then you go out and come up on trumped-up charges and arrest, all of the newly freed men who should have had the ability to vote. That, I think, needs to be done away with.
Do you think people should ever lose the right to vote? If you commit a crime, should you actually lose the right to vote?
It's interesting. I'm an old prosecutor, and I can see how there could be that there is some basis to say, if you've done something so heinous that you do lose your right to vote while you're in prison for certain crimes. I could see that, but losing your ability to vote for the duration of your life, that seems to me is, I guess, inconsistent with what I would consider a just system.
Another policy that I think is really beneficial to young people in particular is election day registration, because a lot of states cut off voter registration 30 days before an election. So you could be watching a debate in October 2020 and live in Pennsylvania or Ohio or a really important swing state, but you won't be able to register to vote anymore. And when I've been in places like Wisconsin that have election day registration, there are usually 200 or 300 people in line just waiting to register to vote on election day. And so states that have election day registration have voter turnouts of up to 10% higher than states that don't. And I think it makes a lot of sense that if you don't register in time or if you have problems with your registration, you can work that out at the poll. So that also seems to me like a thing that every state should do.
Same day registration, and then a healthy period of early voting. Why do we vote on the first Tuesday in November? I mean, think about that. Tuesday? Of all days. If you're going to have one day, it ought to be Saturday, or make Election Day a national holiday. But beyond that, I think having...
You know why we vote on a Tuesday in November?
It's got agrarian reasons.
It's when farmers used to bring their crops to the market in the 1800s.
And I know
so it seems
like
a pretty antiquated
system.
system.
You all bring your crops to the market on a Tuesday, so I know you all don't understand the problem with that. But there are a few people who don't bring their crops to the market on Tuesdays in 2019 in the United States of America. And so, if we're going to have one day, make it Saturday. But I think we ought to have a healthy, say 2 weeks or so during which you can cast a ballot, so that certain people don't have to decide between a job and voting, childcare issues and voting. Not everybody's got the ability to just pick the time on a Tuesday that they want to go and vote. People have obligations. Difficult for them.
What do you think about the idea that we need to somehow change the structure of the Supreme Court?
I actually think that I've kind of been looking at a variety of proposals, and I like this one. Every president should have the ability in his or her first year and third year to appoint a Supreme Court justice who would serve a term of, I think, 15 or 18 years. I forget how it works. I think it's one of those two, which would mean that every president during a 4-year term would appoint 2 justices, and you would term limit. I don't think having justices serve for life. 30 years in an unelected position is a good thing. You end up trying to pick people who are, in their teens or something like that, so they'll serve for like 60 years or something like that. It's actually not that bad. But so I think that having something like that would make a great deal of sense. I also think it's something that you could do without changing the Constitution. Now, it may mean I think you probably have to leave in place the 9 justices who are there now, but then start a process whereby, the next president, first year, third year, and then again, first year, third year, would select justices, and over time, you would end up with a court that I think would be more in tune with the nation. We wouldn't have these gigantic Supreme Court fights that we have, and I think it would tend to depoliticize the court. But I think there's some structural changes that need to be made to the court.
Last question. Are you working with former Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger on his redistricting efforts?
I certainly am. The Terminator and I have done a couple of events together. He is among the few Republicans who has said that he wants to change the system to make it more fair and to do away with gerrymandering. I guess we did an event in Washington, I guess at the National Press Club, and he actually said that Eric and I are going to terminate gerrymandering. And, so he's been out there. We did a joint, op-ed in New Hampshire when the governor there vetoed a very progressive anti-gerrymandering measure. So he's been an ally in this effort.
Right. Well, we're gonna leave it there. We're all gonna terminate gerrymandering.
Can I
Please,
maybe end this
please.
way? We talked earlier about how what young people can do. What I would urge you all, for those of you who are young and who are here and who are young at heart, to be engaged in the life of this nation, to understand that positive change is not promised. There's no guarantee of positive change. It only happens when an energized American people demand it and then work for it. I always say that, Dr. King's line about the arc of the moral universe is long and it bends towards justice. Well, that sounds real good, and it's true, but that arc only gets bent when people like you put their hands on it and pull it towards justice. And that's what we have to do. And so I think finding ways to be engaged in this effort, engaged in the civic life of this nation, is not something that you should think of as a luxury, as an elective. It is something that is a requirement. We have the capacity for great change. I think we also have the responsibility to make that positive change happen. And so I would urge you all, find a way. Ask yourself, maybe every Sunday evening, look back on the week that you've just had and ask yourself, what have I done to promote positive change? And what am I going to do in the week that comes to promote positive change? I know you're very busy, important, school activities. You want to have a personal life and have a lot of fun. Well, graft onto that life just an hour, a couple hours a week to find a way in which you're going to find a way to be engaged and make this nation better, make this nation live up to its founding ideals. This is possible. This is possible. But the question is, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? What are you going to do? Ask yourself that question, as I said, on a Sunday night. If we do this, we can make this nation better. So let's get out there and let's do this.
Please give Eric Holder a round of applause.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
A few before we go.
Thank you.
Pretty popular guy. So
I am announcing my candidacy for president on the basis of this reception. Thank you.
So last thing, thank you again to Ben & Jerry's and People for the American Way. You can watch this again on Free Speech TV later this month. We have free ice cream in the lobby, and I am going to be signing copies of my book, Give Us the Ballot, for anyone who wants them. Eric Holder is a main character in that, so he can also endorse it. Thank you.
All right. That's great. Thanks, man.
That was fun.
That was good.
Thanks a lot.